Humble beginnings. Where a series might get its start may come as a surprise in comparison to what later grew and blossomed with time, hopefully with some trimmed edges and pruning along the way. Many aspiring projects don't always get a proper chance, or have their first games not remembered too fondly due to any growing pains. I would never say this about Contra though. Contra isn't an NES game to me. It's a game on the NES. Every time this game comes to mind, it's not filed in my brain under the designated notions of a title on one of the earliest consoles, something with expected crippling limitations, unrefined developer execution, or excessive clunk in its DNA. It's simply a great game. A genuine, genre-defining masterpiece. This cornerstone of the run-and-gun genre remains a solid first title, and without any unnecessary apologetics. I don't feel a need to explain away the cons by saying, oh, it was the first time doing this, since it wasn't. I ought to provide additional context for its initial impressions. A surprisingly little-known fact is that Contra on the NES serves as a reimagining of a prior entry. Contra in its true first outing was for arcade boards before home consoles took off. If I thought the NES version of Contra was underappreciated, then Contra's arcade version hits a new ballpark of being an underrated gem. Not that they hold an equal bar of quality. While it's not my main interest of subject matter, this version still shows that Contra on the NES was a refinement of something older, but still deserves plenty of praise for the groundwork that still had to be done, so the home version became the legendary game that it is. Reaching a good enough height in popularity, a couple of cabinets for the arcade version of Contra have managed to survive out in the wild. There's some different iterations, but the general shared theme for them is an oddly prominent lush rainforest skin for the controls and on the top. It's disingenuous presentation, due to some context younger viewers might not know. It seems that taking advantage of the soon-to-release Predator film of the same year probably didn't come with any copyright claims. Not like anyone could blame the Konami employees responsible. I think it's a toss-up to say that Contra was directly taking notes from the premise of Predator, given the high amount of Special Forces operations that went on during this time, given Operation Condor in South America, and just tossing in aliens, but I digress. What wasn't part of the cabinet skin would be this Japanese poster much more heavily emphasizing the alien origin and villains of the game, with our two protagonists ready to embark on their mission. Man, this poster's awkward. It's like they had a really hard time of thinking of good ways to pose everything, or didn't bother asking the background artist for a redraw. Just look at the alien head in the middle attached to nothing. You have a glowing egg on the right that's very angry, or whatever the flames are supposed to represent, and the main characters could have used more space for themselves. Same for the tacked on afterthought that's the army truck in the bottom right, probably put there to fill some dead space. If it's just the background I focus on, I'd say it's good, but to me, this poster visually hits just the minimum mark of showing what it's even about. The very dynamic shot of the final stage is done a heavy disservice when you just plaster what amounts to stickers of stuff on it. Why not have the two characters charging forward with something about to hatch behind them? Warning! Aliens approaching! The text says nothing special, just sets up that a Contra is the strongest fighter who's born with great power, the spirit of siege, and guerrilla tactics. It's a gifted warrior that's mastered army combat. It's the future with Bill and Lance, as a spearheading powerhouses to this operation in the year 2633. Besides overwhelming continuous excitement possible, there's a very interesting little blurb here. This kanji stands for levels in a video game, after the number 10. Even with counting each base as a stage, and the last stage into 3 separate chunks, there's only 8 in total. I wonder how much of the game is compromised, because to jump the gun a smidge, there's 2, and only 2, very specific enemies placed exclusively for the hardest difficulty in the first stage in a very haphazard manner. They end up as afterthoughts, vestigial remnants of a more fleshed out difficulty setting we didn't get. This many sprites for these 2 enemies is a bit of a waste. There's some more with these instruction papers just going over basic controls over differently laid out art from the advertisement poster. A Contra is a gifted warrior, blah blah blah, have some standard game advice. Then there's this other sheet that goes back to the whole 10 stages thing. It could have maybe been pushed as an upper management mandate to make this game look bigger than it is, but the stages listed as part of the 10 on the right are just the fixed screens with bosses on them. Either that or the devs push with a weird distinction here due to a compromised vision, and wanting to roll back on seemingly lying, since the screens for these 2 bosses are being given the same weight as full-length, multi-screen levels as we commonly know of them today. Besides that, it's a bit better than the other one with game advice. It's slightly cleaner, with this neat divide of weapons and controls being set aside clearly from each of the levels. In the EU specifically, Contra was renamed to be Grisor instead, though I couldn't find a solid reason as to why. The phonetics for Contra is supposed to imitate the English word Contra, Kon-to-ra. So, I don't know. It's simply the Japanese poster, but with almost no words on it, and some added game screenshots. Not much to say, both for me and the poster. Can't forget about any irresistible force. Have some sex appeal with her Contra because, well, this was the late 80s. I'd say she's about as good as the game, if only these applied to her as well. Okay, I'm done. It's gameplay time. What one sees on the title screen, demo that plays, and on the poster, really is nothing out there. Just two buff military dudes that come to gun down the evil. As more of the game progresses, it shows how it has a rather limited color palette, but that aside, the animations for many enemies, various environments, and explosions carry a surprising amount of detail and flow to their movements. Even if the grayish color is a bit drab, emphasis on grayish really. Gray stone, gray machines, gray trees, more stone, more gray machines, more stones, and a gray alien hideout. At a time where arcade boards also shared many of the derogatory attributes people commonly describe the Genesis sound chip to have, twangy, very buzzy, and high-pitched, Contra managed to adhere well enough to the ancient sound hardware. The tunes managed to not be ear-grating, credits theme aside, and they stick out as catchy, high-energy music to prop up the action. Gameplay-wise, the very first version of Contra is an experience of brevity. An apt player can get through it in just about 10 minutes, with an occasional boss fight and some mild platforming to complement this treacherous endeavor. The game is fast-paced, with plenty to engage with, and hits this mark of realization thanks to being a pretty grounded concept. With this first outing, compared to the vast array of other mascots coming from Capcom, Nintendo, Sega, Atari, and otherwise, both Bill and Lance are pretty normal dudes from an only moderately sci-fi setting. Thus, there's only running and gunning to do with some different weapons to toy around with. Not to say the game doesn't try some ambitious concepts at all. The 3D stages are a very notable highlight to the game as a whole, since they play as good as they look. Hitboxes and hurtboxes never left me scratching my head. The same for if bullets should have hit a target. Aiming in the sections gets simplified so that multi-directional aiming is gone. The most influence going into one's shots outside of running horizontally is by jumping or crouching. This way, bullet trajectories are much more reliable while skirting at the left or right of gunfire, in order to shoot back continuously. I think being able to shoot high while standing would have been alright, though maybe making these sections more readily digestible for people was coupled with giving a control and in-universe reason as to why the player can't go up and down between lanes. Power-ups also carry a good variety. I generally saw them worthwhile to extend the effort to get. They're a good selection of upgrades to bullet spread or DPS in some way. The hatches that open and close, flying pods that contain them, or the orange enemies that drop guns make it so collecting has an extra added layer of strategy, as opposed to something less varied and involved. I think as a whole the game succeeds with giving a good adventure that doesn't get stale, since the occasional gameplay control changes and involved power-ups collection supplement an experience with good gameplay and environment progression. Enemies range from different types of natural hazards, gunners, jogging soldiers, manned and unmanned machinery, or occasional more out-there bad guys. Locales are just as varied, since there's places such as the jungle, the secret tunnel bases, a waterfall, a snowfield, hangar, an energy zone. The creativity here, while still remaining grounded, holds up to scrutiny. That's enough constant praise though. This game still carries with it some typical arcade annoyances. This also isn't to mention the real tall aspect ratio, which isn't fully taken advantage of. The waterfall stage is purely vertical in its progression, and there could have been one more 3D level, but I also thought the game being this tall wasn't of detriment to the horizontal scrolling experience, in part thanks to the slow movement speed. The most detrimental factor to this game, in my opinion, is how harsh and demanding it can be. Some very specific spots don't hold anything back. The impossible odds stacked against Bill or Lance, as opposed to most of the game, abruptly become obvious. Like here, you're better off just dying right away, taking advantage of the invincibility frames, and not engaging. It's something from a selection of examples, like where the turret placement elsewhere is rough and how quick someone would have to react is bonkers. Or at the very end of the game too, especially without any power-ups on hand for these sections, can make these smash fests a tiresome feat. Something to share equal blame with abrupt difficulty spikes is the start of stages typically putting the player in immediate danger, something I find exceedingly rare in most games I've ever played. They don't come off as well considered, like the spawn to the waterfall stage. It's right at the edge of this platform, so it makes me think players were actually meant to spawn at the lowest point, so as to not get so blindsided. To add to that, newcomers of this genre can't expect to get too far without some dedicated practice, since, during this time in early gaming history, developers and companies still hadn't realized how much more their profits could skyrocket by letting players pay for more progress. Instead, they capped it off at a few continues per attempt. Really goes to show how near the inception of video games this title is. As one last thing to note, have something exceedingly unique. The developers drew portraits of themselves into the game's credits. I think outside of this and the recent UFO 50, I have never seen it anywhere else. I think all in all, there's more good than bad here. The typical high arcade difficulty might rear its ugly head at times, but the general game is competently made. There's much to see and do in regards to variety and player expression, with a nice bow of it being an in-and-out snackable venture, and if the harshly punishing sections of the game were removed, or smoothed out to be closer with the rest of the game, coupled with perhaps an expanded scope, more vibrant presentation, and if the premise was better capitalized upon in general, I'd be singing its praises avidly. A year later, Konami went ahead and did exactly all that with the NES version. But first, time to look at the manuals and packaging for the home releases. The front of the Japanese box art contains a cropped out version of the arcade poster. I've already aired my qualms with it, but if they were going to reuse the art, this was a nice way to go. It adds the words, "Emergency command issued," to a curved, yet jagged cutout of the poster, but the image retains similar proportions to its source art. This way, the main characters take much more appropriate center stage, with less of the background to serve as an overwhelming piece. The back of the box art, meanwhile, is fairly good. I suppose my one complaint is what it says could have been more interesting. The bottom left text is just talking about a Contra being a super soldier, a great fighting spirit. You've heard that already. The right just talks about standard features like the three-way scrolling, the high position visual. I think it means good graphics, which is accurate. The weapon capsule method of all things as a selling point, and the sound test. So while the text is nothing more than competent and unimpressive, the screenshots taken from the game are the best they could have possibly picked. Two of the biggest threats in-game with these huge behemoths get individual images, alongside the first game's boss, and also being inside one of the 3D levels. If you wanted the best first impression of the game with still shots, this is basically perfection. The Japanese manual has a neat monochromatic style, possibly to aid the lack of any proper coloring, though it could have also been a deliberate art choice. The top of the page is being made gray, and with a cool little title to designate the different contents helps add some good character. As to some of the background shades and cracks behind characters and shrunk screenshots. The format is solid, with appropriate spacing and font sizes, so nothing feels cramped. Really what you see is what you get. After translating a good chunk of it, anyone unfamiliar with the language could piece together 80% of what this says without hassle. Here's your controls, your power-ups and how you get them, a picture of each stage, and some enemy artwork. There's no extra story or dialogue here, and could have used some more worthwhile game advice. It's solid for what it is. It's kinda good, Alright, for any old action movie fans, you know what's coming. Some three-pronged copyright infringement, straight up, simultaneously. We already had a bit of a contentiously drawn alien for the arcade poster, but now we also have both a Rambo and Predator trace job for the American box art. They were making this as obvious as possible, and a GIF that's been floating around for over a decade saves me any editing work. I can't blame them. Who could? As box art for this game, though, it's a bit of a style mismatch when the characters are looked at in relation to the background. It's also very constrained. Rambo and Arnold already take up so much space, so shrinking it even more was uncalled for. I also wish the logo had better contrast. It doesn't pop out enough from the solid gray. The back of the box has a nice, even if slightly inaccurate description of the game. It words the alien threat and environments with grace, and put some focus on how important it is to succeed. The choice to highlight the top and bottom sentences was good. The images chosen aren't as good as the Japanese version, even if one still does show a 3D stage. The US manual also has its own interpretation of the plot, changing the date of the events to be in the 1950s instead, and in the Amazon basin instead of near New Zealand, with it taking 30 years for the aliens to reach word of mouth, making Contra take place on the same year it released. I do have to give credit to the changed plot giving a reason as to why only a duo set out to handle such a problem, that being political instability. Visually, the manual is a very common black and white from the time. and also complete with some standard and some very ugly illustrations. Bill and Lance look okay, as do the controls and power-up pages, but the stage drawings are really bad. I guess having 2 extra measly pages was out of the question, so we're stuck with these very cramped and shrunk, crappy illustrations. They try to draw them and fail, but also have their sizes further compromised by some really dumb descriptions. And pray you make it past the evil core at the center of base 1. Good luck, you'll need it. If you don't freeze to death or get blasted by an array of alien forces, you may survive. Reinforcements pour in and all appears hopeless. Of course, if you believe in miracles, you'll make it. Holy cow, you made it. The aliens and odds definitely don't favor you here. I can appreciate an attempt to goad players so as to not make standard descriptions for post-it stamps, but this is way too much. I would have just kept the style of description for the first level as the universal format. It feels that and the writer for the back of the box were different authors. So much for the line of text that believes in the player earlier. It's also not like this game is overly difficult. The European version of Grisor meanwhile underwent some notable unique revisioning, really just visually, due to a very specific law at the time. Germany's law on the distribution of works harmful to young persons, which was passed due to needlessly worrisome concerns. Thanks to politician meddling, the lovely developers at Konami were now tasked to edit the game to abide by such a laughable law, in the prospect of continued sales, and thus resulted in this being a war that replaced humans with robots. Apparently that was enough to make it okay. As for this box art, the front is by far my favorite out of these 3. 006 and 007 appropriately take a notable presence with good dynamic poses, really emphasizing their combat duties. It's also got the best bold and striking logo out of all of them. I think the background was a swing and a miss, with how much glare it has. The needlessly obscuring white was a dumb prospect, but it's decently made up for with the 2 aliens on the front that still present the opposition aptly. The background could have also stood to not be so constrained, just like the American version. The back for the box art is pretty much the same. The description slightly different. Look, I've layered the images and the screenshots are in the same positions. They're even the same stages. I no comment. The European manual is fairly close to the American one, also. Pretty short with little to critique. Black and white, with its own very slightly tweaked version of the plot. Hard to say if it's better or worse than the previous manual, since so much of the well-written text for the plot is gone, but the same can be said for the cringy descriptions for the levels. Also, this text in the power-up page that's worded incorrectly. It says power-up items make red enemies, capsule, and pillboxes destructible? They can all be destroyed by the base weapon. Okay, we're done here. The game begins with a full-on cinematic cutscene, an avid rarity for this era. We have the setup to our premise. Reports of a meteor landing near New Zealand brings about the start of the Earth's demise after 2 years. Humanity soon to be snuffed out. Bill and Lance are thus set out to stop the world's destruction. Past this, cutscenes occupy the end of every level. More and more ground is covered, and our heroes give status reports of defeated bosses, or their proximity to designated points on the island. Once far enough, communication is lost, and our heroes have to proceed until they finally finish their mission. It was somewhat white-nosed drivel for me to say the story synopsis, but it had a purpose. I wanted to emphasize how the dialogue present here isn't thrilling or anything noteworthy, which was a lost opportunity with all the work that went into producing them. Once it's all said and done, the game features a secret ending after the credits roll, teasing a cliffhanger for a sequel, but with nothing else to mention. Suffice to say, just showing off the cutscenes for this game is plenty to get across the graphical presentation. This is some of the cream of the crop when it comes to animation and art found on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and all thanks to Japanese exclusive hardware tweaks. In very brief summation, a special chip and cartridge made by Konami allowed for roughly double the storage when compared to its other regional variants, thus giving us cutscenes, extra sounds, animated backgrounds, and an extra music track. It wasn't mass-produced due to cost reasons, thus many of these elements are absent in the version that became by far more known to the masses. Still, the version stuck in Japan can trade blows even with games near the end of the NES lifecycle. Elements such as the tops of palm trees are vivid with a great fluidity, nearly each and every strand moving with each looped frame, looking as clear as they do even with a 3-color limit per sprite. The same can be said for the snow-dusted trees that are equally impressive, while the stage is periodically peppered with snowflakes. The alien lair shows a ton of uncomfortable, squirming, throbbing textures that help invoke feelings of unease and disgust. It's almost hypnotizing with how much of the stage is alive. So many stage elements are a wide variety of colors. A solid gray is now supported by different tints or shades, both bright and dark, in order to increase contrast or add detail universally. No longer are solid gray stones and metal the sole backbone of many stages. Now they're made of different minerals or have added lights and gleam. The two 3D stages still remain visual feats, and they're given extra artistic value since the first and second stage also feature different borders. Even with less processing power, a lowered resolution, and less space for sprites available, the bar for ceaseless motions with enemies was upped and better timing for sprites was also implemented. Standard running dudes and gunners show a less awkward pacing forward animation, better leaps when jumping even though they're still frames, and a better timed kickback for turret shots. I'm not even done. The cutscenes feature Bill Riser by default, but if player 2 has more points, or if player 1 is currently game overed, they change to feature Lance Bean instead. Contra in the NES upholds to a strict high bar of quality with its presentation, and maintains it well, sound design also getting its time to shine. All the tracks lean towards being action-heavy supplements, which doesn't come as a surprise, but also mark points of progressively more heroic acts, delve into tones that help emphasize tension, go a step above that to help prop up imposing odds, or also set a mood for the really creepy and scary. The percussion is off the charts. You can hold a gun in my ass and threaten to pull the trigger, but I've listened to this soundtrack at least 100 times in my life, and I still can't pick a favorite. I can't. The sound effects for different types of gunshots are distinct and pop. Same for energy weapons that are traveling the screen. Other sound effects are conveyed surprisingly cleanly even on such archaic hardware. Like most people would be able to tell these two are the humming of a car, or a siren going off respectively. Just as appropriately said for the numerous explosions that appear with a hard bang, and go out with a satisfying, fading hiss. In spite of the middling story, the presentation for the cutscenes and the entire game is no lower than an A+. Which leaves me to critiquing the gameplay aspects and the tsunami of changes and additions to the arcade title's foundation. With another chance to bring forth a similar, albeit still plenty different vision, the developers didn't waste any time in amending issues and adjusting to new hardware. The game length, while preserving solid pacing from its arcade counterpart, also adds extra level and boss content. Every single stage is made longer by adding more screens. The waterfall that could once be lightning quick in under a minute is now closer to 2 minutes long. No longer is the final stage 3 chunks that are stitched together. They each get an equal amount of extra space to show off. A few extra gimmicks are also added, most notable for the hangar stage with its different behaving spike pressers and the spiked boards that come out of the ground to add even more substance. All of the level design is completely brand new, but they still kept a roughly similar layout for level progression. New bosses also join the fray to make some once footnote ideas stand out much more, such as the boss of the waterfall stage not being an active alien with spiked appendages instead of a forgettable graphical addition to a tower of metal and cannons. The man with the tits responsible for throwing spiked frisbees that was relegated to being a twice-appearing mini-boss is now promoted to proper boss status, as is the UFO in the snowfield so that levels can now have a uniform, congruent endpoint. I just wish they kept the maze structure and time pressure for the base stages. deciding if going left or right in correlation to the way the dot is headed on a map, with some neat depth added to doing them in a hurry. Adding more level length and more proper boss fights is one thing, but how this home version plays still warrants discussion, which means even more praise to follow. 8-way shooting has been introduced as opposed to the original's roughly 16 available shooting angles for some streamlining. I think this goes a good way towards helping lessen possible confusion as to how shooting diagonally works, while still keeping that wide breadth of attacking freedom that made the original so fun to control. Even if locked aiming directions or more variable jump heights aren't available until future entries, they don't feel missing here, since the player is still very capable in the right hands, with or without power-ups. The amount of trial and error deaths have been severely lessened thanks to the change in aspect ratio, and with complementary sprite sizes, besides obvious tweaks to positioning, respawns, and level start positions. Players no longer have to worry about starting a stage and needing to react within a second of dropping in. Same going for no longer featuring exceedingly unreasonable scenarios. Granted, I wouldn't continue and just ignore the times the game does still feature antithetical design, like with the fire bars in the energy zone that don't have a telegraph for if they work on proximity or what range and speed they'll fire at. The turret manning enemies that just needed a bit more lenient time for their shots so they don't blindside people, or the really boring cars that lock the screen and rely on a power-up or excessive mashing to get rid of in time. Again, thanks to the game being still only about 10 minutes long, any required start overs are much less of a blow to the player's motivation, since such relatively short ground is needed to cover to retry later stages, but enemy and gimmick behaviors like these are still worthy of scorn. They're not the biggest issue of this game though, which I apply gladly and harshly to one of the game's power-ups. The spread gun is the most iconic weapon for this series, and it all started here. While the power-ups in the arcade version were all fairly balanced, even after doing several runs, I still struggle to say which one's the best there. Here, it's no contest. The spread gun can really trivialize certain spots and basically every boss. All it needed tweaked was a more limited amount of allowed bullets per screen, just like the other weapons already do. Mashing while this thing is active really shreds anything in close proximity, and tackles any threats an immediate 8-way shot might not reach. It hurts all the more, since while the machine gun and laser are still direct upgrades, the fire shot is just a downgrade. The added range is not compensated by the very sluggish speed, especially when a good amount of enemies and capsules might be missed due to its lethargic path. I think another simple change that would have severely lessened the blow of power-ups being this unbalanced, while adding a surprising amount of replay value, is just making item drops random. An extraordinarily obscure fact is how both opening weapon pods and collecting power-ups actually awards players with points. Not that there's an active score counter to occupy the gameplay screens, it only shows up during some transitions. In spite of this appearing like a forward-thinking move on the surface, this actually has a negative effect on the game, because gameplay consideration of defeating enemies isn't going to be nearly as prominent in any player's minds. And much more importantly, points still give lives in this game. Outside of the abrupt sound effect that tends to be tied to bosses since they give several dozen points, and a small added life icon that caps at only 4 instead of having a number tally, players don't have a reliable score system when wanting to expand their ability to make mistakes. Killing enemies and bosses gives points, yes, but not everything destroyable does, and how much some enemies are worth is very hard to note down. I ended up requiring a forum post to assign them here. Looking at a quick overview of the amount per, generally the harder to reach and defeat enemies are worth more than the standard goons, and only things directly killed by the player add to the score tally. Enemies falling into pits or spikes won't reward anything. Co-op is the last big thing to talk about here, something that's simply due to the fact that it exists, since it's real time as opposed to some lame in-and-out turn-taking. While it wasn't uncommon for arcades, developers working on consoles with choked processing power either compromised when including multiplayer, or were games that already featured an elementary structure. As opposed to the earliest Nintendo releases, Contra is a vastly more ambitious game, and even to this day, serves as the go-to co-op game for the console. 2 people playing at once was practically an afterthought, an ever-daunting task, or a daydream feature, at best, for everyone who worked on the console. But Contra went ahead and took advantage of this feature so casually. Co-op works pretty well all around. It doesn't do anything crazy, but the most negative notable factors of it start with a slowdown that occurs very sparsely. It really only seemed to happen during the waterfall boss for short bursts, since the game already does such a magnificent job at alleviating performance, thanks to the excessive flicker for sprites. Visibility also took a mild hit, Sprites flickering enough can make it harder to react to some threats that pop on screen, with the camera also being more lazy in a sense. It won't scroll right until both players are running forward closer than what's normally needed, but the restricted scrolling managed to not really bother me. I stuck next to my little brother for most of the time, and that worked just fine. So to recap, the spread gun's too good, there's still some trial and error moments, points should have been shown at all times, and the co-op can be sometimes a little shaky. Okay, that's kind of it. Oh, one last thing to say in closing is how there's even additional touches to the game when it got forcibly downgraded for overseas. The American version, even with the simplified graphics, still had tweaks made for it so that it wasn't a standard dumbed down version, with Pro Protector later being based on that, and still doing some more palette changes so colors had extra contrast. Even after the game was finished, they still went out of their way to give each version a few noteworthy touches, showing how much they cared to keep iterating on their work, instead of settling for the bare minimum. Contra was the result of a magnificent team coming together and forming the catalyst that spawned a landfill worth of copycats, ports, homages and other titles, and at one point, a remake exclusive for Chinese arcades that later got ported to mobile phones, I kid you not. And yet another reimagining in the form of Contra Operation Galuga that also came out just last year, alongside the well-established series of games in the Contra line, which would in time reach the magnificent apex with Contra Hard Corps, the glamorous crown jewel and undethronable best title in the Sega Genesis. In terms of impact, I think Contra still fell short in favor of other titles that were either much more advertised or were first-party and slightly sooner attempts, namely the first Mario Bros. But sales and successes are hardly ever dead consistent with quality. Much of the time I wish Contra and Mario had swapped places, but I'll leave things off here. I have a hard time using the word masterpiece, given my standards of using such a term are only for the best of the best. Games that I can confidently call genre defining, something I'm willing to hand out to less than 20 games I have ever come across, and if I had only one title from a respective genre to remain in memory, I could confidently pick it. This is one of them. Oh, yeah, my videos up to this point have a bit of a habit of closing during the credits, but Contra doesn't. It just keeps going. The developers also programmed a pseudo-hard mode that loops and gets harder with each subsequent run, so you can just keep playing and have something to continually improve on. The video's over. What are you still doing here? I've got more game to enjoy. Go away.